Welcome to the Transforming Trauma podcast. Transforming Trauma is presented by the NARM Training Institute. I'm your host, Emily Ruth, and I'm so glad you've joined us today. Hi, Transforming Trauma listeners. We're thrilled to share with you that the new NARM book is coming out on July 26th. The Practical Guide for Healing Developmental Trauma Using the NeuroAffective Relational Model to Address Adverse Childhood Experiences and Resolve Complex Trauma is written by our very own NARM creator, Dr. Laurence and NARM senior trainer, Brad Kammer. This book is designed to promote personal and collective change. The intention is to make NARM accessible for anyone working with or dealing with complex trauma. Using therapeutic examples and helpful exercises, Brad and Larry demonstrate how NARM can serve as a catalyst to promote healing and post-traumatic growth. Whether you are a mental health or other helping professional, or simply interested in personal growth, we hope you will find this book useful in your professional work and personal healing. The Practical Guide for Healing Developmental Trauma is available for pre-order now on Amazon and other online book retailers. Please visit narmtraining.com/books to stay up to date on the latest news, promotions, and giveaways. And now for our episode. Today you'll hear from Dr. Laurence and Brad Kammer, who together wrote The Practical Guide for Healing Developmental Trauma. This book is a companion piece to the book Healing Developmental Trauma, written several years ago. I'm so excited to share this conversation where we explore the roots of this new book, why they wrote it, and who it's for. They also share more of how this practical guide builds upon the foundational principles shared in the first book and further clarifies the NARM clinical model as they highlight several new points that are embodied in the approach. These clarifications differentiate this model from other models in the field, and Larry and Brad are eager to share with listeners today some of these significant differences during our time together. Please enjoy our conversation. Well, I'm so happy to be sitting here with NARM creator Dr. Laurence and NARM senior trainer Brad Kammer. Welcome both to the podcast.
Thank you, and nice to be here.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thanks, Emily.
So we're here to talk about the new book that's coming out. I'm really excited. I have a bunch of questions, if that's all right, if I can ask you all the things. So the name of the book is The Practical Guide for Healing Developmental Trauma, Using the NeuroAffective Relational Model to Address Adverse Childhood Experiences and Resolve Complex Trauma. And there's a lot in there. So Larry, let's take it away. Where would you like to start?
Well, I just want to communicate to our listeners that this is like the companion piece to the book that was written now close to a dozen years ago, where Brad and I in this book really are focusing in much more depth on the clinical model. I was able to present some of that in the first book, but there were a lot of other things that took up space. And our focus in this book is really to, explain and clarify and present to many people the clinical aspect of the NARM model.
Wonderful. Larry, what would you like listeners to get out of our conversation today as we talk about the book and what your intention was for the book?
Well, what I really hope is that the book will clarify for readers some really new points that I think are embodied in the NARM clinical approach that in some ways sound like maybe other systems, but as they read the book, I think they're going to see that Brad and I are coming from a very different place, even though some of the languaging might be similar to other models, that there really are some significant and important differences. And Brad and I have tried to highlight that in this book.
And who would you say this book is written for?
Well, I see it for clinicians, of course, for people in all of the various helping professions. And there's a big audience of those people who are not therapists themselves, but are interested in their own growth, interested in their own trauma recovery, if that's been part of what's going on for them. The first book, and I'm assuming the second book too, will draw a lot from the general public, generally people who are interested in therapy and personal growth and such.
It's important for us that, making this work accessible, it was a number one goal for us in terms of this book. And NARM is a very complex model, and we wanted to do the best we could to be able to really deliver it in a format that clinicians who, for whatever reason, might not be taking our trainings or might not yet take our trainings can use some of the information that we present in our much longer therapist trainings and other trainings for helping professionals in a direct and accessible way. So it's really about, taking a very complex model and helping people apply it in a way that is it takes a lot of training to do.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want us to forget, too, that we've also got a large population of therapists who are already trained in NARM.
Mm-hmm.
And this book will also provide for them a kind of cohesive and coherent model, whereas they've learned it over a period of many years. This will put everything together to make it more easily accessible for them as well as the other groups that you mentioned.
Yeah. And I wanted to add, we also wrote it in mind that there's a lot of people that are just looking for resources to help them with their own developmental and complex trauma. And there's just not a lot of accessible resources out there. They're coming, but we wanted to make something that was going to be directly relatable for people that are working as professionals and also people that are just looking for their own healing. And I know, Larry, you can talk more about this, but Larry's first book with Dr. Aline LaPierre, Healing Developmental Trauma, really captured a lot of people who were finding Larry and Aline talking about their experience, their personal experience. And so we also wrote this book in a similar way that it's, very theoretically heavy and focused on skills that you could apply from the theory, but also in a way that hopefully people that are just looking for their own personal growth or trauma healing can really use this book for that as well.
And readers will find that we put some experiential exercises in the book as well, whether that's for the general public or for clinicians. This embodied understanding that we're trying to communicate in the book is very important. And so we did include exercises as well as some transcripts, again, to help people really see how the model is applied, sessions with clients, so that people can see how the model is applied in actual clinical settings.
That's great. It sounds like there's opportunity there for the practical application. And I know that that's important for a lot of us. I'm curious, as you were talking about the first book, if someone's hearing this podcast and they haven't heard of your first book or they don't have your first book, they haven't read it, would you suggest getting the first book and then reading this one, or does it matter?
I wouldn't say it's an absolute necessity for experienced clinicians if they have read the first book, although I still would recommend it for everyone if they haven't read it.
Great.
We wrote it in mind that a lot of people hadn't read the first book. And so it is a standalone book, but obviously it's going to be useful for the depth of NARM to understand the theory that was presented in the first book. This book is really much more specifically focusing on the clinical application, the therapeutic application, whereas the first book was really outlining the larger theory of it. And also, that book has now been out for 10 years and we've evolved NARM and we're really excited to share what's happened over the last 10 years since that book was first written. So that's really exciting to share that as well.
Wonderful. Yeah, that's what I was wondering, is for a lot of folks that they're just kind of coming into this space and this might be the first that they've heard of your work, that the second book really is a standalone book. They could get this one first, and then if they'd like to go back and get the second one, they can do that too.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, I read a quote that Dr. Gabor Mate wrote about your book. Is it okay if I quote him and ask a question? Is that all right?
Sure.
Please.
He said that the practical guide for healing developmental trauma, quote, offers a thorough and clear guide to a modality of therapy far deeper than the prevailing cognitive and behavioral treatments. It is highly promising because it goes beyond the surface manifestations to the root causes and dynamics of human distress. And I read that, and those are some words that build it up. I wondered if you could share more about this perspective a little bit.
Well, it is, of course, a powerful endorsement. And what I appreciate about it is that it really goes to the heart of what it is that we're trying to do in this book and in NARM in general. That's our orientation, is that a regular part of our focus is not just on extinguishing symptoms, which is very much out there in the field as that's what's needed to be done, is that we're of course wanting to help people with their symptoms, but we're always looking at what it is that's actually driving the symptoms, because so often symptoms are just communications to the self that something is off. And they're not communications that we want to extinguish in NARM. They're communications that we want to help people learn how to listen to. And Gabor really captured, I think, our orientation in that brief paragraph there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I appreciate that. I love that image of the check engine light, that if we just turn off the check engine light, we're not addressing the root cause. And that's what I think of when I hear that this book really is offering, like he says, a clear guide to going deeper than just the cognitive and the behavioral treatments. So yeah, that's exciting.
It's important, for both Larry and I in our careers and where we are at now with NARM, is part of what we want to contribute to the trauma-informed field is alternatives to the prevailing cognitive behavioral treatments that are so dominant out there, at least in the United States. And I think it's elsewhere as well. And I think one of the things that's so cool about Gabor, his quote, I know that he's also interested in that as well. And he really saw that in our work and in our book. And, there's such this movement for short-term models, like more cognitive behavioral models. And there's a lot of controversy around actually their efficacy and the research behind them. And, I'm sure that all these models have their place, but for Larry and I, it's very important that we're introducing a depth-oriented and somatic-oriented and relationally oriented. Those three are checking boxes that are very important when working human to human. And I think, I won't speak for you, Larry, but I know that we've had a lot of conversations on some of the more prevailing trauma-informed models have been lacking. And readers will hopefully find in our book something very unique that we're attempting to communicate. And like Larry said, I mean, there's a lot of models out there that are doing similar things, but I think that we have very important contributions to also offer the field.
You both kind of touched on something that I was thinking, and that is, what is your overall vision for how the book might contribute to the field? I know, Brad, you were kind of moving in that direction in your last response, but I wondered if there was anything else you wanted to kind of drill down around that.
Yeah, I mean, even the organization of the chapters of the book, I mean, we start with the first chapter talking about the trauma-informed movement, and it's a very new movement in a lot of ways. I mean, the research is on the adverse childhood experiences is less than 30 years old. Complex PTSD as a diagnosis doesn't even yet exist in the United States. It's a brand new diagnosis for the World Health Organization. So there's really exciting and important things that are happening in the trauma-informed field. And so we started with just a chapter giving a framework of what's going on, where we've been, where we are. And then we move into chapter 2, which is really where NARM is playing a role, or we hope it will play a role in terms of supporting this movement. And then we move on from there. Like Larry said, we're going through next 4 chapters. Chapter 3, 4, 5, and 6 are about the 4 pillars in NARM. And those are the clinical foundation of the work. And then we build on top of it. From there, we have what's called the NARM emotional completion model that we have. Chapter 7 is focused on. The R in NARM, the NARM relational model, is chapter 8. And then we have what's called the NARM personality spectrum, which really gets to the organization of the self. And Larry can talk a little bit more about this, but we differentiate between shock trauma and complex trauma. And one of the differences, at least according to the CPTSD diagnosis, is they focus on the organization of self. And there's 3 categories that are associated with that. One they call negative self-concept or self-identity. One has to do with what they call affect dysregulation or affect regulation, depending on which way you want to look at it. And then challenges in interpersonal relationships. And this is what NARM is designed to work on. Those 3 elements of the human experience is really what this book is designed to, and the model is designed to focus on. And so in that chapter, we focus on what we call the NARM personality spectrum, which is another way of looking at and working with the self. And then, as Larry mentioned, the last 2 chapters are clinical transcripts that one is a session that I did, one is a session that Larry did. And we don't just kind of go through and, have the therapist and the client talking. We actually took the time to annotate using what we've introduced in the first, 200 or 300 pages of the book to talk about the different pillars and the different principles and skills that we're using with our clients so that people can really get a sense of it. As you know, Emily, a lot of people watch videos that come through our training, and we're doing the best we can in a paper format to really help people see how Larry and I are organizing these NARM principles as we're working with someone, and then how we're applying them directly.
Just in terms of really helping our readers understand that distinction, as Brad touched on, and I just want to emphasize that. And again, those 3 elements that fortuitously were part of the World Health Organization's, CPTSD diagnosis were on the title of the original book, because that's really been my focus and now our focus, even before that very important diagnosis from the World Health Organization came out. So the readers will see that just like in the clinical model, we're focused on a client's inner world. That's, I think, partly what Brad was referring to when he was talking about depth. We're not just looking at the surface. And again, as I touched on, is that symptoms are really the superficial representation of a deeper distress that's going on. It's a way of, beginning to address that. We don't ignore symptoms, but we don't want to make it all about symptoms.
I wonder, why do you think there are so few books on developmental and complex trauma?
Well, it's in a certain sense, in terms of the history of psychotherapy, it's a relatively new understanding. And traditionally, what was looked at were, again, in the DSM is still the case, the symptoms of CPTSD, anxiety, depression, and other kinds of things, but they don't look at the coherent driving force that triggers all these various symptoms. And very importantly, the World Health Organization saw the need for that and thought it was important enough to make it an official diagnosis, which they did just starting this year. And so one, to go back to your question, is I think it's relatively new. There's not a lot out there. There are many systems that are trying to retrofit their model to fit complex trauma. And I find more or less successfully, depending on who's trying to do it. But from the very beginning, we've been focused on working with CPTSD and the various elements that are associated with that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's by definition, the complexity of complex trauma is that when you're breathing the air of unresolved complex trauma, it's hard to actually see what's around you. And, Freud did make attempts in his early career to talk about the impact of relational and pervasive trauma, particularly that was happening in family systems. And he got, depending on who you read, but there's a lot of accounts that he was attacked very viciously and even threatened in certain cases. And he changed some of his perspective. And this idea of trauma really kind of sat there for many years until it really picked up steam, I think, in the 60s and 70s. And then in terms of complex and developmental trauma, PTSD became a diagnosis in 1980, but Judith Herman wrote her book, Trauma and Recovery, in 1992, which is 30 years ago. She has a chapter in there called A New Diagnosis, where she introduced the term complex PTSD. And here we are 30 years later, and there's still no diagnosis for developmental trauma. I used to work with kids. There's no diagnosis for developmental trauma, which means that you have to give children other diagnosis that misses the impact of what they're actually living through. And it has real life implications, because when a child gets diagnosed with ADHD or conduct disorder or depression, whatever that is, they're put on medications at a young age. They're often stigmatized and shamed. They internalize that they're somehow wrong or bad instead of the environment failing them. And so there's a whole societal challenge that, again, I feel hopeful that the trauma-informed movement is part of helping us wake up to that. There's been a lot of good movement in the last 10, 15 years. Oprah Winfrey is a big advocate for it. There's a lot of celebrities that are coming out now in support of understanding complex trauma. But like Larry said, in terms of models that are really specifically designed for working with attachment, relational, developmental trauma, I think, again, NARM has something unique because it's specifically designed exactly for the impact that children have had and how they've had to adapt to the ongoing trauma.
The other real life aspect of that too is that when there is an inadequate diagnosis, then there isn't money for research. And that's a big, big obstacle in the way of the movement of moving forward with this. And I think it's, speaking to your question earlier, Emily, why there has been, so relatively little written in this field is there just hasn't been financial support to do the research that's needed.
Yeah. And by the time this episode airs, Larry will have presented at the 33rd annual conference that's organized by Bessel van der Kolk on trauma. And, that's a really important conference that's been, Judith Herman is actually one of the presenters with Larry. It's growing in terms of its impact, not just in mental health, but on society. I've been shocked. I think I told you this, Larry, that Bessel van der Kolk's book about The Body Keeps the Score, I believe it came out in 2014. It is still in the top 20 or 25 on Amazon bestselling list, which is incredible for a mental health book. So that just shows, in Oprah Winfrey's book that came out in the last year with Bruce Perry, that's also been a bestseller. Alanis Morissette has a podcast now focusing on elements of trauma. I mean, there's some really exciting things that are happening. And yeah, we're excited to be part of that. And I hope you have a really good experience, Larry. And I look forward to hearing about it. Maybe you'll come in on the podcast and talk more about it.
I will. I'll be happy to.
Yeah. That'd be wonderful. Gosh, hearing you both speak, thinking about all the pioneers that really have been working without a diagnosis, without the funding. I'm just feeling so much gratitude right now as I think about all that it takes to write these books, the time and effort and energy that you've put into it, that all of the folks who have written books on this topic. I'm just feeling a lot of appreciation right now. And Larry, you mentioned earlier that this book would be good for those who might be interested in their own personal healing, experience. And I'm wondering, okay, if someone's hearing this, they might be asking, okay, well, what does that mean for me? If it's good for me, I apply, what's in this book. I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit more.
Well, we address so many important themes that I think even non-clinicians can relate to. It's like the role of emotions in human life and what happens when people have significant and important emotional themes that are unresolved in their life. And generally, I just find that there's a large audience for more information about this. We talk about shame in a different way than is presented, in other contexts. So there is a lot of material there for the general public, even if they're not planning on being clinicians but just interested in the whole general field. And I think Brad and I tried to write it in a way that makes it accessible to this group as well as, coherent and meaningful for clinicians as well.
I know you mentioned there's some exercises in the book, and I wondered if you could share a little bit about what those exercises are. Can you give us kind of a taste?
It's really important for the way that we teach NARM. It is a body-mind model, and there is a really important theory. It's an important theoretical framework, and it's very important for us and for the model itself, for people that are learning NARM to have a direct experience with it. You can sit there and listen to it and think it sounds really interesting. It's a whole nother thing to have a direct experience of it. So the editor told me the other day, we have, I think, 37 exercises in the book. I didn't realize we had so many actually, but yeah, they're all designed for people that are working with complex trauma. You can apply these or adapt these to working with your clients directly or for your own learning and growth. Emily, again, in our trainings, how those exercises are. They're often very simple, but very powerful.
And Brad and I have this orientation with these exercises. We tend to have one exercise that helps people become more aware of dynamics that have been going on and they didn't really have a handle on clearly. And then we often have another exercise that helps them at least move the needle in the direction towards resolution. We're not promising that they're going to be able to resolve trauma just from reading this book, but this understanding that can come from the book will help people in their process and in their progress moving forward in their lives.
That's exciting. Can't wait to get my hands on this. Let's see, July, you said it comes out July what?
26th.
26th. That's exciting. So I know that you mentioned earlier, there are 2 whole chapters in the book where you talk about, or you have client sessions that you kind of notate. And I wondered how you use those, examples of those sessions to illustrate perhaps the key NARM principles and concepts and skills.
Well, both Brad and I have, as was mentioned, we've annotated or deconstructed particularly our interventions. Sometimes we talk about the client's process as well. Everybody reading can understand what's going on in our mind, Brad's and my mind, when we're working with the client, what it is that we're holding, how it is that we're seeing this, how it is that we're framing it for the client to help them work through it. And so, this is again just another way of understanding the model in a more felt sense or experiential kind of way.
Yeah, sometimes we refer to it as pulling up the hood, just to pull up the hood, because again, the intention of the book is to make it accessible, to help people really see how we're applying what they're learning or reading about. And so we really deconstruct line by line, our intention, our hypothesis, even how we're touched, how we're impacted, our own countertransference dynamics, whatever might be there. We're really doing the best we can to be transparent so that people can understand how we're working with the NARM principles in our own experience to best support the client that's sitting in front of us.
I really appreciate that. And I want to highlight that piece that you said, what's going on for you internally, because I know most of us going through a grad school program, that's not something that's talked much about. In fact, if anything, if it's talked about, it's like, you need to get rid of that. You need to deal with that. And so I appreciate the way that you're holding that. I wondered if you could speak to that just a little bit for our audience, for those who might not be as familiar with the model.
I do know that that's communicated to people going through graduate programs, like they're doing something wrong if they're having some kind of countertransference reaction. We clarify that that's not the case. As a matter of fact, it's an inevitable part of the therapeutic process, just like transference is that, and for therapists to understand their own limitations as well as their own strengths is really important. It doesn't mean you can't work with people, but when we realize that, let's say maybe in certain areas where we've got unresolved issues of our own, for example, that then we might need to get peer supervision or some other kind of supervision if we run into difficulties with a client. But at least this will help you become aware of, in a non-judgmental, non-pathologizing way, as we tend to do, what are some of the issues that you as the therapist or the helping professional may be running into when you're dealing with this level of experience in other human beings, because it can be a very challenging, complex trauma when we're talking about from the earliest days of our lives can be really tricky and painful and challenging, and then of course very gratifying as we help people resolve it. But it's easy for therapists to get stuck in the process. So we're giving both, cognitive and awareness understanding, but also in their emotional reactions that get in the way. And we try to help people identify those in a way, just as you said, Emily, that's very different from what I've seen, at least most people tend to get in graduate school.
Yeah.
Just giving like a little teaser for readers about this. We break down countertransference. So countertransference is the reaction that a helping professional, a therapist, is having while they're sitting with the client. And like Larry said, we value this information. This is really important information that we're having as therapists, as helping professionals, working with another human being. And so we differentiate into what we call big C and little c countertransference. And one of the keys that we're doing the best we possibly can is to differentiate what's being driven from what we call big C countertransference. This might be material on our own that is, we all have unresolved, material to some level. And when we're working with suffering and pain and these reactions that our clients have, that can get stirred up inside of us, or just our feelings towards the client themselves. There could be challenging clients that trigger us in specific ways. If you had parents that were very narcissistic and you have a client that's extremely narcissistic, that could be very difficult. So that's what we kind of group into more of this big C countertransference that we outline in the book. And then we talk about the little c countertransference, which has more to do with the resonance in the field, or what people might call intuition, which is NARM, again, is a somatic oriented model. And there's a lot of elements from the field of interpersonal neurobiology that Larry and I draw from. And it's this understanding that we are wired to be in connection with other people. And we're picking up all sorts of information that we're having a direct experience of. We might not always be conscious of what it is, but we're going to help our readers and people that learn from us about how to drop more into that, because there's really valuable information. And there's a quote, Emily, you've seen this quote, but I like to use it in the trainings. And it says something about learning to differentiate between the difference of intuition guiding us and our trauma misleading us. Mm-hmm. And that's really what chapter 8 is all about. It's really about helping people deconstruct this relational, this intersubjective process.
That's great.
Another element too that I think we're really trying to help both clinicians, helping professionals, and the general public understand the limitations of a certain kind of goal-oriented or symptom. I talked about symptom reduction-oriented models, and we go into great depth about the difference between that. And it's like the challenge by focusing on trying to get the client from A to B, whereas in NARM, we know that our natural state is to be at a more connected place. And in general, the work is around exploring what it is that's getting in the way of us having the kind of connection that is all of our birthright: connection to self, connection to others, and connection to something greater than ourselves for those people who are oriented in that direction. And so I think part of the contribution that I'm hoping, and I see that Brad and I are doing here, is to see the limitations of trying to get the client to change without understanding what it is that's, really getting in the way of real change from taking place and embodying and really helping people change their lives.
This piece of the countertransference and transference, I'm just kind of realizing, gosh, if I hold, countertransference with, what a lot of us are told in grad school that I need to just deal with it. And I have sort of this aversion to my experience with that how could I not also feel that way about what the client is experiencing with me, you know,
That's a great example.
and that
That's
I'm putting
good.
that in the field. If I hold it like that, that's what my client will experience as well. And so anyway, I don't know if there's much clarity around that, but that feels really important. And I'm excited to read more of what you have to say about that in the book.
Great.
Yeah. It's great.
Awesome. Well, Larry, I'm wondering, could we start with you? Could you share with us, what is your favorite chapter in the book?
Oh, that's hard. It's like asking a father who their favorite child is or something like that. I don't think I can say a favorite, but I think the one that I'm so proud of and happy to be able to present, that Brad and I are presenting here together to, our readers, has to do with this emotional completion process. There's so many other important chapters, but I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about the role of emotions in human life. And we go to great pains to really be as precise as we can about, primary emotions versus secondary emotions, or default emotions, as we sometimes call them, that distinction. And then we try to give clinicians tools to help them know exactly what it is that they can do when dealing with a whole array of human emotions, which of course in a therapeutic process we tend to come up against, they tend to come up quite regularly.
Wonderful. What chapter is that?
It's chapter 7.
Chapter 7. Great.
Yeah.
Brad, how about you?
I like what Larry was saying. For me, the most challenging and probably most rewarding chapter is chapter 5, which is on agency. It's the third pillar in NARM. I don't know about you, Larry, but for me, it was extremely difficult to write because the way that agency is used, not just in psychology, actually, it's agency is used in a lot of different fields, and it doesn't quite capture how we use it in NARM. And it really was a deep dive for me personally to go inwards to really experience it. We actually surveyed a whole bunch of clients and people that have been through our training to get them to help us, share what their experience of agency. And we actually have a page in that chapter that gives some of their responses because it's so touching, actually. And it's a very powerful chapter. There's two things we hear mostly from people that come through our trainings. One, Larry already referenced, which is many therapists are learning through NARM to work with less effort, which is really important for burnout. It's a huge profession for burnout, being a therapist or being a social worker or any kind of helping professional. So that's number one that we do talk a lot about in the book. And then the second thing is people often reference agency as being a game changer, that a lot of these things they've learned in other modalities. In NARM, we have a lot of uniqueness in how we put things together, but agency is something I think that's very unique in this model. And so I'm proud of that chapter. It was difficult. I think we did absolutely the best we could to put it on paper. And I'm sure we'll be writing more about it in the future. But
yeah, I too, of course, have heard the feedback from many people about how different it was from what they've experienced in other models. And they're often very well-trained people. This piece stands out to me as something that I've never really come up, or understood before. And it's a part of a major shift that we present in the book away from story and into process. And we see agency as kind of the bridge between the past and the present. And as we work with and understand that bridge, the general experience, both on clients and the understanding of agency, brings with it a kind of freedom that they never imagined would be possible, to see that they had choices where they had no idea that they had choices, for example, and a certain kind of humility and embodiment that comes when you're able to own your own unresolved material, and how helpful that is for people in relationships, for example, what a difference it makes, not just to the person who's doing the work on themselves, but then how different they are with other people in their lives. So again, the feedback has been so gratifying and just so positive about agency that's why I couldn't pick just one chapter, because I love that chapter too. And it is complex, as Brad mentioned, but I think we did a pretty good job of clarifying a multilinear process in a unilinear kind of.
You said something that caught my ear. You said moving away from story and into process. And for someone who might be listening who really appreciates story and kind of sees that as an important piece of their healing, I'm curious, what would you say about that? Why is it important to move away from story and into the process?
Well, it's good that maybe you help me to clarify that, because I'm not saying we ignore story. But what I'm saying is that this idea that's very popular in the general culture as well as in the psychotherapeutic and helping professional culture, which is I'm this way because such and such happened to me when I was 3 or 4 or 5. That's an oversimplification. And many therapists kind of just let it go at that. Okay, well, I have trouble with people's anger because my father was a rageaholic. Well, the reality is that when a client, let's say, has difficulty acknowledging or feeling or expressing their anger in a healthy way, that, that there are multiple elements that are involved in that. And part of it could be related to the story and the father's rageaholic tendencies, for example. But it's always an oversimplification. And so there's a really strong focus, which Brad and I communicate in the book, about looking at the intrapsychic dynamics that are there, not just on a cognitive level, but on an emotional level and on a somatic level. But to use the traditional word intrapsychic, because how to work with these conflicts that we've all carried since childhood, and what we call in the book the core dilemma, which is not addressed in any other model in the way that we address it, as far as I know, at least.
Yeah, I wanted to add one more piece to the story. We talk in NARM often that many things can be used for connection, to support connection, or to support disconnection, to reinforce disconnection. And story is a good example of that. In cultures and communities and family systems, there are stories that are actually very important for the fabric of the community or the family to stay together. It supports, it becomes a deep resource for people. It gives meaning, it gives orientation to the world and to life. And then we all have stories that are actually really in our way because it's defining who we are in a way that's not necessarily really who we are. And we identify with those family or cultural stories in a way that actually limits our authenticity and our possibility for greater connection to self and to others. And so we do a lot of differentiating strategies that people use for disconnection, which were survival strategies for children. And then they come into adulthood and that's just part of their personality. That's just what they do. And they don't realize how those strategies are now serving disconnection and creating symptoms and suffering. And then we're supporting the movement in our clients towards moments of connection. And story, can be part of that, although it's not so controversial, at least in some trauma circles, that people try to tell their story and it actually reinforces the old trauma patterns. And so NARM is a somatic oriented model. So we're focused on really supporting shifts that don't reinforce those old strategies, but are supporting something that can resolve and transform.
I really appreciate you both speaking to that, because I imagine that for a lot of folks, that's a really important piece, especially if they grew up feeling very connected to story and maybe their cultural tradition is very much rooted in story. And like you said, Brad, that can be such a resource. And then this piece of differentiating, what stories am I kind of replaying that I'm disconnecting from myself because of that process? So I appreciate you both differentiating that and sharing more about that. I wondered too, if there were any key ideas that you think would be helpful to share with the audience in terms of the book.
Well, related to that last little piece of conversation, I think one important element that we're hoping that clinicians can take away, or everybody can take away from the book, is the importance of working in the here and now, because it's only in the here and now that this connection-disconnection dynamic that Brad mentioned can really be seen and plays itself out. If you're in basically just cognitively working material, it's not so obvious. But when we're dealing with whatever difficulties the person is wanting to address in a here and now kind of way, which the readers will have to check to see how we do that in the book, because it could be confusing, but working in the present moment, then that's part of that process-oriented dynamic, because the process is revealing itself literally moment by moment in the client's relationship to self and the client's relationship to us and in what they tell us about their relationship with other people.
Brad, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think one key idea, we've talked a little bit about this, but I think it's nice to name it a little bit more directly, is, all of these strategies and patterns that we develop to manage our early life, we're really in NARM supporting people to have a different relationship to those strategies that isn't through shame and self-rejection and self-hatred. And that's generally, talk about the air we breathe. I mean, when I became an intern, I remember that was the thing that was most surprising to me, is how vicious people were towards themselves. I mean, just vicious, and sometimes it's conscious and sometimes it's not conscious. And I think, part of, again, the vision of our institute and what we're doing with these books is helping people have a different framework so they understand the adaptive value that these strategies played at a certain point in their life when they had no other resources or options, and that they can start to relate to those strategies as they get older in their life in a new way. And, whether we want to call that self-acceptance or self-compassion, whatever that might be, that to me is part of this humanity that we're really trying to support in NARM, moving away from pathology into really humanizing everyone that we work with, including ourselves as helping professionals.
I just want to, that's such a point that you just made, Brad. I just want to acknowledge that. And so, that really has been my mission for the last 30 years, which is to bring the human element back into the psychotherapy field, because it can be so mechanistic, it can be so pathologizing, it can be regressive. And what we're presenting in this book is really an antidote to some of those more, pathologizing, regressive kinds of approaches.
Kind of as we move toward wrapping up, I wondered if there were any ideas that were presented in the book that really impacted your professional development, your personal life. Can you speak to either of those areas?
Well, I can start just based on what I was just sharing a moment ago. Is I know for me, when I first met Larry and started learning from Larry and getting support, this idea of, what we talk about, the connection survival style, was very strong for me, both within my family system and my culture and intergenerationally for me. And the struggles around, I think that's why I was attracted to somatic therapies and depth-oriented, spiritually oriented therapies. I was looking for some way to feel connected in my life. And I found a lot of things that felt either coercive or harsh or difficult to metabolize and stay present to. That's one side of the spectrum. The other side of the spectrum is just things that just felt very misaligned and incongruent for me. And, when I started learning what was predated NARM, Larry didn't have that term yet for the model that he was developing at that time when I first met him. I just felt this humanity piece for me was so important. All the shame that I was relating to myself through really helped me to have a whole new experience to myself. And as I started to have a different experience to myself, I started to see other people differently and see the world differently and have a whole different experience of my life. So I'm just really grateful. I'm at this place now where I really want to be less afraid for myself to use language that feels authentic to me. And one of the pieces that really bothers me about Western psychology is how belittling we have talked about certain terms or certain understandings. For example, just this weekend, I was following this whole Twitter thread, and they kept on calling these things woo-woo. Like that was the language these psychologists were using to talk about things like traditional Chinese medicine. They mentioned the polyvagal theory and other embodiment approaches. And I believe my experience, my direct experience when I'm doing NARM in many different situations is that we're touching into something sacred. And these words of the soul, they don't fit that well in modern psychotherapy and psychology. But to me, I think this is something that, I know Larry's also been interested in this, but just bringing this back as part of the humanity. This is spirituality and deep connection to living system, the earth, and to spirits or to other people has always been around humanity. And we've pathologized that. And I think that when we have access to this deeper source that trauma blocks us from, we see things and talk about things a little bit differently. And I'd like that to be less pathological. I'd like us to be able to talk about the soul without it so quickly becoming woo-woo, or to talk about deep, meaningful, intimate connection we have with other people through these words of sacred or whatever that is. And for that to be held as part of why we're alive. And so if one person feels that from our work, I'd be very happy and honored. So.
Another four-letter word that we use in the book that tends to be completely absent from the psychotherapy vocabulary is the word love. And the word heart, well, that's five. There's more than four letters there, but the word love in particular, and heartfulness. Mindfulness is also part of the NARM work, and our teachers focus on heartfulness as well. Because that, coming back to our hearts is in a certain way coming back home. And it was really important to both Brad and myself that we communicate that level of experience in our work with clients, in our teaching of clinicians, and in this book itself, that we don't want to ignore such an important element in the human experience.
I like the way you said that. We don't want to ignore what is such an important element of the human experience.
Want to celebrate it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you both for your time and for sharing with us a little bit about your process in writing this book and how it's affected you both personally and professionally. And I wondered if there was anything that feels important that wasn't said that you want to add before we close.
Well, I think I'd like to add is that talking about hearts, I think I'm safe in saying that for both Brad and me, that this project does come from our hearts, along with all of the teaching that we do and everything else. It is a process that very much involves our hearts.
Yeah. We're just really happy to share it and looking forward to connecting with people around it. And I think this is a nice place to end, actually. We've just been really touched about how much support and excitement and gratitude we've been receiving from the people in our trainings. I mean, since we first announced this book, it's been really touching, very deeply touching to see how much NARM has impacted people that are part of our community. And I know a lot of the listeners out there are regular listeners to the podcast, and you're part of our community as well, of course. So we're just the next step of us sharing this, and we're just really appreciative of each one of you.
Well, thank you again. We look forward to July 26th when the book comes out, and they can start pre-ordering, I know, on Amazon and other online booksellers, and we're excited. Thank you so much, both of you.
Yeah, thank you, Emily. Very nice talking with you.
Yeah. Thank you, Emily.
Thanks so much for joining us for today's episode. To find more about our guest and their work, check the show notes or visit us at narmtraining.com/transformingtrauma. The practical guide for healing developmental trauma is available for pre-order now on Amazon and other online book retailers. Please visit narmtraining.com/books to stay up to date on the latest news, promotions, and giveaways. Thanks to Andrea Klunder and the Creative Imposter Studios for producing and editing, to Tori Essex for our album art, and to Brad Kammer for the creation of this podcast. We look forward to building community, connection with you, and changing the world by transforming trauma.